Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. Duncan, it's great to have you a guest on All Across America, and it's great to be a guest here at the Recycling Center in the city of Keene.
Yeah, welcome to King Duncan's Palace.
King Duncan's Palace, all right. Well, one of the most amazing stories in your book is the shocking turn of events for the way that you got this job in 1992. Maybe we could start with that, and you could tell us a little bit about that story.
Sure. Well, that is, most people don't get their jobs this way, but back in 1992, I was finishing up my graduate degree at Antioch, New England University, here in Keene, and I was looking at the bulletin board and saw that there was a job posting for a solid waste coordinator for the city of Keene. But unbeknownst to me, at the same time that I was looking at that job posting, there had recently been a murder up at the recycling center where I was going to be destined to work. And it turned out that there was two employees that worked at the facility. They had known each other previously from having a relationship when one of them was a prison guard and the other was an inmate at the local county jail here. And they got increasingly sort of into verbal altercations that resulted in a threat that one of the employees made to the other one, which is basically like when one employee was going to go off to National Guard duty, the other employee was going to go over to that person's house and kill their wife, rape their wife, kill their children, and burn their house down.
And the boss was the prisoner, and the employee was the guard.
Well, it was the supervisor. The actual boss is the one who ended up catching the flack. So why don't we start this story completely over again?
Okay, all right, let's do it.
Okay, so the reason that story is so unusual is that back in 1991, there was two employees that worked up at the Keene Recycling Center. And the Keene Recycling Center at that time was a two-car garage and a very primitive operation. And these two people had a previous relationship. One of them had been a prison guard at the county jail, and the other one had been a prisoner. And there had been a working relationship that was fraught with issues because of that former relationship, and there was a fair amount of bullying that was going on from the one who was the former prisoner. And just threats and just constant bullying went over weeks and months that this was happening. And then one day, finally, it sort of came to a head where the one who had been the prisoner was telling the other person who was the prison guard, when you go on your National Guard duty next week, I'm going to go over to your house and I'm going to rape your wife, I'm going to kill your children, and I'm going to burn your house down. So the guy who used to be the prison guard was like, wow, that's crazy, and just left work, got into his truck and drove away. About 15 minutes later, came back with a 9mm and emptied a clip into the other guy, killed him, and then sat down, put the gun in his lap, and waited for the police to arrive. And he was arrested, charged with murder, and during the grand jury proceedings, they refused to indict him because it was considered justifiable homicide. But all while this was going on, the city, in its infinite wisdom, didn't know what to do with this person who had just killed a fellow employee because there was nothing in the personnel manual that sort of dealt with this kind of thing. So they ended up, letting that person go for conduct unbecoming. But then, furthermore, they felt like the supervisor of the facility should have known that this tension was happening and that it could result in something problematic like what happened. Yeah. And so they decided to let him go. That created the opening for me and my job. And I knew nothing of this when I applied for the job. Even when I took the job, I still had no idea this had all happened.
Wow.
So when I was sort of accepting the job and the public works director was busy shaking my hand saying congratulations, he said, and Dunk, the measure of your success is to make sure that nobody gets murdered at the dump.
It's not very high of a bar.
Right. So, that was a pretty good bar to set right there. But 33 years later, so far, so good.
All right. You've been an astounding success. No murders.
No murders. Yep. No murders at the dump.
All
yep.
Right. Wow. And you got started working in, we'll call them dumps, transfer stations, recycling centers back in 1972, was it, in your hometown in California?
Yep, in Tiburon, California. I was the lone attendant at the time of the Tiburon, California Recycling Center, which consisted of, a fenced-in area with a couple of dumpsters, and they did some standard recycling, newspapers, glass, steel and aluminum cans. that was about it. And it wasn't a really busy place. Tiburon wasn't a huge community at that point. Yeah. And I was all of 11 or 12 years old when I took that job, and I liked it because what they basically offered as a perk was getting paid to break glass. Right. That they're going to pay me to break glass, and then furthermore, I discovered serendipitously that in amongst all of the papers that were collected for the newspaper, people would sometimes slip the odd Playboy or two in there. Right. So for a 12-year-old boy, finding a Playboy magazine, that was a pretty good nugget of gold right there, right. And that would make the attendant job worth it.
So maybe we should talk a little bit of vocabulary, because there's dump, there's recycling center, transfer station, landfill. Tell us about that, and also I guess that it kind of plays into the evolution of the area we are here in Keene. Sure.
Well, dump is the colloquial term that that everybody's used for decades, right. Generations of people. I'm going to the dump, yeah, and that is a reference to a facility that is going to be where you're going to take your trash or your recycling.
And a verb, you're going to dump it.
Right, exactly. You're going to dump it, and back when this facility first opened back in the 1950s, it was nothing more than a giant hole in the ground, and there was some machinery there to deal with it. But people would drive down into the hole and throw the stuff out the back of their pickup trucks, and then go on with their merry life. There wasn't anything else here. Right. And over the years, we started developing new words for things, whether it was a recycling center, a materials recovery facility, or a MRF, transfer station. So these things are slightly different, but the dump is sort of what encapsulates all of them. So a transfer station is nothing more than a facility where you bring the trash to it, and the trash will then be offloaded from one vehicle and put into another one to be sent to a disposal destination, whether it's an incinerator or a landfill. A recycling center is just what it says, but a materials recovery facility is different from a recycling center in that a materials recovery facility is a mechanized recycling center. So most small communities in New Hampshire have recycling centers because they don't have a lot of machinery to help them sort and separate and process their materials. We do here.
Oh, wow. Okay. So what does it look like? All right, let's say I come in with 3 bags. One is filled with newspaper and cardboard. The other is filled with glass. And then the other is filled with household trash. Mm-hmm. Where do they all end up?
Yep. So if you have that scenario, those 3 bags with those different things, you're going to check in at our scale house, and the scale attendant's going to ask you, what do you have? And you explain to him what you have, and then he'll direct you to where you need to go. He or she will direct you where they need to go. So the trash is going to end up going into our upper level where we have dumpsters, and you just put the bag of trash in there, and we take care of it from there. For the recycling, with a newspaper or glass, the newspaper will come down to the recycling center and be put in the fiber area where we have mixed paper, including magazines, catalogs, junk mail, et cetera, and then the containers, the glass in this case, or the glass mixed with plastic or steel or aluminum, those all get commingled, mixed together, and we sort them ourselves as a quality control step.
Okay. And so where does it go from here?
Well, it goes into the world. These are commodities, and they're sold into the global commodity market. Okay. So it's difficult to say where anything ends up specifically, except that I can tell you that for our part here, I know there's been a lot of questions in other places whether if something gets put out as a recyclable, does it get recycled or not? Here, we take great pains to make sure that if people go to the trouble to prepare their recycling for recyclables and it arrives here and it meets our specifications, we will absolutely get that product to a market to be turned into a new product.
Now, in the trash, I think you wrote in your book that it goes to an actual landfill in Manchester, New Hampshire. Is that correct?
Rochester, New Hampshire.
Rochester, sorry.
Yep. It's about a 90-mile one-way trip. Wow. It goes over to Rochester, New Hampshire, and that's that landfill is called Turnkey Landfill, and it's operated by Waste Management.
Okay, and so that's its final destination. Is it incinerated in some respects, or is it just actual landfill in the ground.
Yeah, this case, there's no incineration as part of this mix. There are incinerators, waste energy facilities, but we don't use one of those. We just send it directly to the landfill.
Okay. And so some municipalities do the incinerator route. Others just send it to a landfill.
Yeah, it depends on what they have available to them.
And so, so this was a land. I mean, you could see right over here as we're over. This was a landfill at one point. Can you describe how it changed from a landfill to a place you could play golf on? I guess.
Well, so back in the 50s, when this was originally opened up as a landfill, it operated continuously for probably a couple decades, and then there was an actual stream running through the middle of the landfill at the time in the 70s. That they decided was causing more problems than it was solving. So they decided to close the landfill down at that point, and they started using a different site within the city compact. But then they decided that they didn't like that site, so they wanted to reopen this one. And so they rerouted the stream around the landfill, and they had a big hole that they wanted to fill up. And the original intent was that the people who owned the property, it wasn't the city. The city was leasing this property as a landfill. And it was hoped by the people who owned the property that they would be able to rise up high enough so that they could develop a housing complex so that would have these amazing views of Mount Monadnock, which, obviously you can't see this on the podcast, but we have probably one of the more stunning views of Mount Monadnock. And Mount Monadnock is the most climbed mountain in the world.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yep, it just recently surpassed Mount Fuji.
Wow. Why?
Because it's accessible. There's a huge population center nearby. I mean, it's accessible to the Boston market. I mean, obviously, there's a lot higher mountains in New Hampshire, whether it's Mount Washington or any one of the mountains in the White Mountains.
The White Mountains,
right? But it's more the accessibility. It's probably an hour and a half from the Boston area versus a couple more hours to get up to the White Mountains.
Okay.
And it's a reasonably challenging hike, but not so challenging that it's not accessible to even the most sedentary hiker.
Gotcha. Okay, so it's easy ride over from Boston up the mountain, and you're back home for dinner, sort of thing.
Pretty much,
Gotcha.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, and it's got a great view at the top. In fact, you can actually see the Boston skyline from the top.
Is it above tree line, the summit?
Yeah, it is, because long ago there was a fire of the top of Mount Monadnock.
It's not naturally above tree line.
Right. And what's interesting about Mount Monadnock is Monadnock, in its actual term, means impervious to erosion. So at one point, everything around this area was at the height of the top of Mount Monadnock. It was called a Keene plain, but during the glaciers, when the glaciers started melting and the meltwater was shaping the landscape, Mount Monadnock was resistant to the erosion that was going on in the surrounding areas, and so that stayed as a promontory. But Keene, proper where we are right now, was just a giant lake.
All right, and so they couldn't build the homes, clearly.
Right. Well, I mean, there would be a problem with gas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Methane gas.
Yeah, I mean, it would have had some great views, obviously, but there would have been some problems with, if the person who had built a house on top of a landfill was a smoker, they might find themselves blowing up.
Wow. Okay. And can you talk about the methane gas? Because I think that's a lot of things. That's something that people don't really understand.
Sure. Well, I mean, methane gas is just one of the byproducts of decomposition. It's a gas that's produced by the decomposing organic matter. And basically, a landfill is just nothing but a biological reactor. And so anything that's organic, as long as it has access to air and water, that decomposition process continues to happen until there's no more organic matter to decompose. But one of the byproducts, as I said, of the bugs doing their work is methane gas. Methane represents somewhere probably between 50 and 60% of the gas composition. There's hydrogen sulfide. There's other gases in there as well. The sulfides are what make the landfill smell. If the landfill ever smells, it's because of the sulfides. Yeah. Methane is colorless and odorless. You would never know it, except if you lit a match and there was enough methane gas, then you would definitely know it. We back in 1994 recognized the potential. We were not of a landfill of a size that required us to do any gas management. We were fairly small. And just for comparison purposes, the amount of waste that's in that landfill is approximately 850,000 tons, which is about the amount of waste that was produced when the World Trade Centers collapsed.
Okay.
So just for context purposes, that's about how much we've got there.
Right.
In 1994, we installed 5 gas wells in our landfill, and we started running a 250 kW generator to generate electricity for our operations. And then when we closed the landfill for real in 1999, we installed a few more wells, came up to a total of 17 wells, and then we continued to run our landfill gas to energy generator, providing all of the power that we use for our recycling center. So we were completely off the grid, utilizing this methane power.
Wow.
Until about 2016, 2017, when that started to peter out. This is a unlined landfill, but the cap is basically fossilizing the waste. So there's no precipitation that can get into the cap. So it basically stops the decomposition process and therefore the methane generation. So once the methane generation gets to the point where you can't use it for energy, we basically now flare it off, and we replace the landfill gas generator with a biofuel generator.
Okay.
So we don't have power lines running up here other than single-phase power, but we can generate our 3-phase power using post-consumer vegetable oil.
Wow. And when you talk about the methane, you're essentially lighting the gas on fire to make it go away.
Yeah, controlled explosion, as it were.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what any engine will do. It's a controlled explosion, moving the pistons and
internal combustion.
Exactly
engine.
right.
Okay.
Exactly right. Yep.
All right. And so in terms of, I think there's a lot of misconceptions and misnomers about recycling, and in the city where I live in Connecticut, they recycle plastics, for instance, 1s and 2s, but there's 3, 4s, 5s, 6s, and 7s, and a lot of municipalities don't take those. Can you talk a little bit about that? There's
Sure.
Bottles and jugs, right?
Yep.
1s and 2s?
1s and 2s, yeah. I mean, then the reason that 1s and 2s are commonly recyclable is that they're generated in sufficient quantities that make them a marketable commodity. Yeah. And that really is the limiting factor with the other types of plastics in general. It's not that they're not technically recyclable; they are. They're just not normally generated in the volumes that you would need to make them successfully being able to be recycled. And that's why there are some things that are coming down the road that will increase plastic recycling and capture those other grades of plastic. But in the meantime, I'll give you an example. So any one of the plastics that's not a 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. There's 7 different plastic grades, and if you look on the bottom of almost any plastic container, you'll see the chasing arrows.
Right, the triangle.
Right, which give you the impression that it is a recyclable item, even though they're not commonly recyclable. Yeah. But if I was to say, okay, I'm going to start collecting number 3 plastic, we have these bins, these storage bins that we call Gaylord containers. They're cardboard boxes that are 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, one cubic yard of material. I need 40 of those to make 1 bale of material. So I have to have storage enough to have 40 of those cubic yard containers. And then once I've got that, I can make that bale, and then I've got to store that bale until I have another 20 or 25 of those same bales. And for number 3 plastic, it's generated in such low volumes, all things considered, that it could, in theory, in a community of around 23,000 people in Keene, it could take me several years to have enough of a marketable quantity of that. And that's why these things are not commonly recyclable in communities of our size.
I see. Okay. So we're talking much larger cities can make that happen.
I think that, larger cities can make that happen, but, frankly, there really isn't the infrastructure to deal with it. I mean, if we had more space, we could probably do it here. Yeah. But, we just don't have the critical mass of volume of waste to be able to do that in a reasonable way. But, down the road, there are going to be facilities that are going to be, we'll be feeding into these types of facilities as opposed to just sending our stuff to a landfill. And these facilities will be able to enable us to get into the recycling of 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, and 7s.
Okay. But so for glass, for paper, for metal, that you don't have that same problem.
I mean, we do and we don't. I mean, these are common recyclables, and the markets will fluctuate as commodities. We don't know what the price of any commodity is going to be anytime that we get ready to sell it. But we rely on the premise that recycling, its primary value is in its avoided disposal cost. So what I mean by that is that if I've got a ton of recycling and I didn't recycle that, and I sent it through my transfer station and said it would cost me $99 to get rid of that ton.
Right.
That's what I pay the landfill to bury that material. Where if I don't bury it, I don't pay that $99. So there's the savings right there off the get-go. And maybe I'm selling it for $20 a ton, or maybe it's more than that. I mean, sometimes commodity pricing can be, extremely lucrative, and sometimes it can be incredibly low. It just, we don't play the market for that. We don't stockpile materials until we see better markets. We just, we do the dollar cost averaging type of processing and selling our commodities into the market.
And you were saying, Keene transfer station has done a recycling center, I should say, 250 million pounds of recycling and $10 million in revenue, and avoided $25 million in disposable costs. So that's a net of $35 million.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah. You
deserve a raise and a promotion, Duncan.
Well, except that, looking at it from that perspective, that's not bad, okay? I like those stats, and I appreciate that. But the simple fact remains is that, back when we built this facility, we went from single-digit recycling rates to double-digit recycling rates. But we're sitting here, all these years later in the mid to low 20% recycling rate.
Right.
Which to me, honestly, I think about it in terms of the fact that, that was a big leap, the quantum leap that we needed to go from single digits to something better.
Yeah.
And that was an investment in the infrastructure, and now we need another investment in infrastructure to take us to the next game.
Right. And you're saying at home you recycle 80%.
Oh, easily. Sure.
How do you do that?
Well, it's a little bit of I'm knowledgeable in terms of when I'm shopping. I know to pick products that are commonly recyclable, and I try to shy away from those products that are not recyclable. I also compost all of my organic waste.
Wow. Okay.
And that does represent a lot of material at the end of the day.
You don't have two small children at home, I presume, either, like I do.
Well, I used to, yeah. I used to have small children at home. They're adults now, but even when they were around, we had a pretty good diversion rate at our house.
That's incredible. And what do people think that is commonly recyclable but is not, like pizza boxes, for instance?
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion, and this is why I'm convinced that we're not going to sort our way out of this problem. We're not going to educate our way out of this problem. The simple fact of the matter is it's all about infrastructure, and I'll just give you a little example. Some of your listeners might recall one of the seminal events of 1969 was landing on the moon.
Right.
Pretty amazing accomplishment for humankind. Remarkable technological achievement. But it wasn't until 1970 that the first patent was issued for suitcases, wheels on suitcases. So, in 1969, we're all watching the moon landing, and yet we're dragging our suitcases through the airports. And we were lacking the proper infrastructure. 1970 was when the patent was first issued for wheels on suitcases, and it was a game changer. I don't think you can practically not buy a suitcase
right.
without wheels on it these days.
Right.
And it was a game changer. Just like when we installed the highway system in the United States, 1956 is when it was first authorized, and 44,000 miles of highway. Multi-billion-dollar investment, but it also, reduced travel times, by like over 20%, going from point A to point B. And so this is what we now need in order to, more properly recycle things, because we need to use technology that's available today to have a much better result. And so we can dispense with the questions of, what about the pizza box with the grease on it? These decisions need to be made at those facilities that are processing this material, because I don't want the consumer to be the one that's making that decision as to what's recyclable or not, because it's too much to think about.
Throw it away.
Exactly. There's too much to think about.
Yeah.
It's too complicated.
Right. And I've heard of something called single stream recycling, where you're just putting even trash recycling. I think they do this in New York City on the subway. Everything just goes in the garbage bin, and then it goes on a conveyor belt, and it can be sorted that way. Is that kind of the wave of the future, the hope?
Yeah, so the acronyms or the terms that are used can be kind of confusing with this. So we operate in Keene a dual stream recycling center, which means that we keep our containers, our recyclable containers, separate from fibers, cardboard, or mixed paper. And so we process those materials differently. A single stream will generally mix the paper and the containers together.
Okay.
And so single stream recycling is really just a slightly different way of using a mechanized system to pull the recycling out of the waste stream, but they're only sorting for those recyclables. Whereas the next generation that's going to come along, for lack of a better word right now, I'm going to call them advanced materials recovery facilities. Whereas in Keene right now we do about 8 sortations. These advanced materials recovery facilities will look more towards around 70 sortations. So they'll be looking at the waste stream in a more holistic way, and they'll have all the technology that's available, whether it's nuclear density, air classification, optical sorting, ferrous and non-ferrous metal, and then the human factor will be into it as well. But it'll be looking at the waste stream as a holistic thing versus looking for the cream in the crap.
Gotcha. Okay. And you mentioned the human factor. You had talked about there's some folks on work release who have worked at the recycling center. Is that still happening?
I wish it were. I mean, that used to be. They used to have a program in the Human Services Department that if you were down on your luck and you needed to pay some rent money, they would allow you. They would help subsidize your rent money. But in exchange, you had to come up and work in whatever public works function that we saw fit. Yeah. So we did have that program for quite a while. That's great. And then that's evolved, so we don't have that anymore.
That's a bummer. I remember reading a story in News of the Weird, which was a syndicated column by a man by the name of Chuck Shepard, who has since passed. And it was a story of a couple gentlemen, we'll call them on work release, at a similar facility like this one, and they were fresh out of prison and I guess hadn't had the taste of alcohol in many years, and would take the tiny little sips remaining in the bottles, and by the end of the day were highly inebriated.
Necessity is the mother of invention.
Have you had any incidents where people have thrown away, I don't know, a wedding ring or something of some family heirloom where you've tried to recover it?
Yeah, we've had those kinds of things that you see on the news sometimes. Yeah. I mean, whether it's been a wedding ring or something that was of value to somebody, that's happened, multiple times up here. And sometimes we find it, and more often than not, we don't.
That's rough.
I mean, you're really talking about the needle in the haystack here.
Yeah. I mean, so are you able to trace, like, okay, this person, I don't know, dumped a bag of trash with a possible wedding ring on last Wednesday, was taken to Rochester, New Hampshire, and this is where the space in the landfill in Rochester, New Hampshire, I mean, could they pinpoint it to that degree? I mean,
insofar as that would be a yes, they would be able to pinpoint it to some degree. But then, when you're looking at it in terms of the sort of the scale and the volume that you'd have to sort of go through in order to, I mean, because Rochester's taking, thousands, in a week's time, they would be taking thousands of tons of material.
Okay.
So that working face that they're working on would be the location it was in. But I mean, it would be worse than a needle in the haystack. I mean, it would be veritably impossible to find something like that.
There was, I'm sure you've heard the story, the Bitcoin guy in the UK.
Yeah.
And he has, I don't know, a pass key with a Bitcoin wallet worth $100 million, and he's been in litigation for, I think, 10 years now. And it's in the dump, and the dump is closed. And he wants to buy the dump from the town, and they won't let him buy the. I guess he has a group of investors, probably.
Yeah, I can see. I mean, there is such a thing as landfill mining. It actually is something that exists, and that technology to do that is pretty primitive. I mean, it's just like any kind of mining operation.
Sure.
But to find that pass key, good luck to you.
I mean, even if you do find it, the idea that it would even be recoverable seems far-fetched.
Exactly.
I guess for $100 million, he thinks it's worth doing. But
yeah. Yep.
And I remember reading, you've got there's something called an aptronym. You've got Bernie Madoff, for instance, the sprinter Usain Bolt. Your initials are DPW.
Yeah.
Department of Public Works, for those
right. I mean, when you have a name of Duncan Pepper Watson, initials being DPW, I guess you're destined to work for Public Works. No question about that.
So can you tell us a little bit more about your job? And I know you've got the Fleet Division, Highway Division, Solid Waste Division. What a city manager is versus a mayor.
Sure. Well, I mean, in Keene, our system of government is a strong city manager form of government. So we have 15 city council members. and they're divided up into 3 subcommittees, whether it's finance, municipal services, or planning, land and development. And so any issue that comes before the city will ultimately get referred to one of these subcommittees for a recommendation as to what to do. Okay. And then once it's decided what to do, then the Public Works Department or the Parks and Rec Department or whichever department has that issue, then they enact whatever was decided at council. And in the city of Keene, in Public Works, we've got 2 assistant Public Works directors, me being one of them, and my portfolio being the highway division. So anything that happens in the roadways, snow operations, sidewalk repair, potholes, et cetera. The fleet division, which is all of our rolling stock. So whether it's a lawnmower or a bucket loader, those types of things. We do all the servicing in-house by and large. Okay. And then the solid waste division, which I am the solid waste manager in addition to being the assistant public works director. So I oversee the operation of the solid waste division, but the day-to-day operations are being done by one of my assistants.
Gotcha. Okay. And then, so a strong city manager, I mean, is that suggesting the mayor tends to have a bit more of a ceremonial role in Keene?
Yes, precisely.
Okay.
Yeah, the city manager is the one that is responsible for the day-to-day operations, and the mayor certainly has input to things, and they've never been shy about expressing their opinions.
Of course, yeah.
But in this sense, that they don't normally get into the business of directing city employees to do anything. When that happens, and it happens on occasion, and I think that people just get ahead of themselves. It needs to go through the proper procedures, and that's the city manager making the direction, because we work for the city manager, but the city manager works for the city council.
I see. Okay. And then does the city manager report to the mayor? Like, how does that work?
They report to the council. They're council employees.
Wow. Yep. Okay. And so who reports to the mayor?
Well, the mayor, again, is more of a... I mean, the mayor is there... they don't have a vote on council unless it's a tie break.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And there's 15 members on the city council, so usually you don't end up with a tie unless somebody's missing.
Right.
And they do run the meetings. They do the agenda setting and whatnot. But and then they are involved in setting up the committees themselves. But the city manager's role, as you mentioned before, is a little more ceremonial, and the city manager is the day-to-day CEO.
So they're the CEO. Okay. And so how many city managers have you worked under?
Oh, gosh. So I'm on my 4th one now.
Wow. Okay.
4th one now. And Elizabeth Furland, who was recently married, her name was Elizabeth Dragon, but now it's Furland. She's been my city manager now for the last 5 or 6 years.
Okay. Wow. And that's a tough job.
It's funny. One of the city managers that I worked with for the longest, John McLean, just very skilled man, and I used to watch what he did very carefully and think, gosh, that's really a thankless job to have. And but he always used to encourage me, saying, he thought that I had what it took to be a city manager.
Wow.
And I just never saw it because, the patience and the political savviness that's required. Right. I'm a little more mercurial in that way. I don't suffer that kind of stuff that well, and so I don't think that I myself would have made a particularly good city manager.
It's a tough one. It's a minefield to navigate.
Yeah, I'm not great at biting my tongue.
Right. Although you did have one story in the book where I think it was a city councilor that had suggested the roadkill be used. Maybe you could tell us that story.
Yeah, I mean, bless her heart. There was a city councilor who, the intentions were all good there, but in sort of out of the blue, it was somehow the topic of roadkill came up, and I think they wanted to know how procedurally we dealt with it, and of course when somebody calls in a roadkill to the Public Works Department, we will send a crew out there to pick up the roadkill and dispose of it. Mm-hmm. But the city councilor was asking out loud what it would take to skin the animals and create clothing out of them. And it was one of those moments where I really had to stifle, my immediate reaction, which was to guffaw at such a suggestion, because I was like, but then, as we started to dig into it further, I mean, I did the research and went to one of my guys at the highway department who was a hunter and who does tanning of hides. And when I asked him, I told him what I was doing, and when I asked him what it would take to do that, he looked at me like with one of those quizzical looks, and he said, "Are you out of your mind? You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about." And then he asked a really critical question, which I had not asked. He's, at what level are you stopping skinning of the hides. I mean, are we talking squirrels and up, or are we talking, larger animals? And so it was kind of a funny situation researching it, and then having to go back and report out saying, this probably wasn't the best way to clothe the homeless.
Right. Yeah, I think there are easier ways.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I don't know if you ever saw the show Parks and Rec, but that show to me is really endearing because so much of it rings true to what really happens in municipal government.
Right.
And it's that kind of thing that it's that humor that honestly has kept me going and kept me sane all these years.
And you were telling a story, speaking of mayors, of one of the former mayors who was not a fan of the transfer station. Oh man,
this one mayor, and he's no longer with us. He's taken the journey over the Rainbow Bridge at this point. But so I feel okay to speak about this. But he was not a fan of the solid waste division, and me in particular. I'm not exactly sure why. I don't know what I did to make him angry, but I did. And this was back before we had completed this facility. He drove into the landfill and did not want to wait in the line that we had queued up to get up into the landfill to dump their stuff. And we had also subsequently changed our access road, and nobody, unless you were directed, you wouldn't necessarily have known. So as he goes flying by the scale house, and us trying to wave him down, saying, hey, stop. He just drove by and then started driving up the old road, which was now the working face of the landfill. And one of the things that we used to bury in the landfill here was the biosolids from the wastewater treatment plant, which would arrive here every day at around noontime. And, for those who don't know what biosolids are, that's basically poo that's had a lot of the water removed from it, but it still has
concentrated poo.
It's concentrated poo. It doesn't have a lot of water, but it looks like it shakes like Jell-O. I mean, it's really quite something, and it just doesn't have a lot of structure to it. And it certainly does not make a good road base, which the former mayor discovered in short order as he tried to four-wheel his way up to the top of the landfill. But he got stuck in a patch of the biosolids and kept spinning and spinning, throwing up the poo all over the place. And it was funny because we actually watched him eventually sort of, go through the machinations in his mind to decide, when he was going to give up, because it just wasn't going to work. And so eventually the backup lights came on, and he started backing up the landfill, but he lost control of the vehicle, and it came down the hill so quickly that it went off the loading ramp that we were next to. And so his back wheels were now off of the loading ramp, and he had to get us to pull him back off of that ramp. And then not a couple weeks after he had this incident, he was not happy at all. And a couple weeks later, we got a bill for $800 to replace his tires that he had ruined in his attempt to go up the face of the landfill, which we paid.
Wow. And, I mean, it's a good story of paying it and kind of biting the bullet. And, that's a city manager move.
Exactly, right. And that's the difference between me and the city manager is I would have been like, hell no, we're not paying that, right? I would never have paid that bill. But, he was more savvy than I was. And it ended up, we never had another negative word said about us after that on his radio show. So
probably worth the $800.
It probably was, for my sake, for sure.
Yeah. And so, what are things happening now? For instance, there's a bottle bill that passed in Connecticut. It's now 10 cents per soda can, which I think is amazing. And we used to drink a lot of seltzer in our house, and I still do, but now I do the seltzer machine. But it ended up being you'd buy a couple cases, it'd be $5 in return. So we stopped doing that, which is good. I guess it's less of a premise for a Seinfeld episode.
I was going to say, that would change the equation on that Seinfeld episode big time. And as opposed to going to Michigan for the backhaul. Yeah, I think that obviously bottle bills, what they're designed to do is just reduce litter, have been incredibly effective. Okay. But New Hampshire, has had active lobbying against bottle bills forever. And the way that they've approached the bottle bills, or the lack of bottle bills, is to develop an organization that's funded by the Grocers Association in New Hampshire called New Hampshire the Beautiful. And the New Hampshire the Beautiful provides bags for roadside cleanups, right. And that's one of the things that a bottle bill is pretty effective at, is removing those types of deposit items from the litter that's commonly found on roadsides. That said, I'm not necessarily a fan of bottle bills. I'm not a fan of bottle bills. I just think that anything that we're going to do going forward really needs to be something that it moves the needle. And right now, all the things that are being talked about as to ideas that we want to try aren't really going to move the needle in terms of increasing diversion. Right. We're going to stay stuck, all across the board in our low to mid 20% diversion rate until we invest in infrastructure.
And it's about the technology as
yes.
well. Okay. And so that's where you see the path forward is just an improvement in technology. I mean, is there an incentive for added technology? I mean, if you could make it, I mean, obviously money is a big motivator. Is there not the incentive for that, or? Well,
no, there is. I mean, there's a very good and compelling business case for going into these advanced materials recovery facilities. I mean, number one, if these things come to pass, then overnight, once one of these facilities opens and you start feeding them, now all of a sudden 80% of the discards that you produce will get reused in some way. Whether it's through the recycling markets, or maybe it's going to be through pyrolysis or refuse-derived fuel of some sort. They're not going to end up being buried. 80% of that stuff. 20% will end up getting buried because they're too small, incompatibles. Those kinds of items. But I mean, overnight we go to an 80% recycling rate. That sounds like a much better idea.
That's huge, yeah.
And the economics of it are such that it's equal to or less expensive than our current practice, which makes makes it feasible. And then more than anything is that the public sector doesn't need to invest any money in this. The private sector will fund this. The municipalities, such as they are, would just simply need to commit their waste streams to these facilities so that they had the assurance that they would get the product that they would need to process.
Right.
And so, to me, this is it's not just a good economic argument, but it has some environmental benefits.
Sure, of course.
As well, because 10 to 15% of the contributions to greenhouse gases are from waste-associated activities.
Wow.
So, if we're able to make some headway in better management of our discards from a greenhouse gas perspective, that might have some role in helping to reduce the existential threat we're facing right now.
How many years away do you think we are to be able to make that happen?
I would say we would see one of these facilities online in the United States, don't know where, within the next 5 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. I mean, you'd imagine it would happen somewhere here in the Northeast just because of the big population centers. Any sense, or California maybe?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Northeast is ripe for it. I mean, the thing is what you need the waste shed. So the New Hampshire has enough waste that generates in New Hampshire alone to support 3 of these advanced materials recovery facility campuses, as it were.
Just in one state.
Just in one state.
Wow.
So if you've got your Boston waste shed, which is going to be a huge one. You've got Hartford, Connecticut. You've got Springfield, Massachusetts. I mean, there's a waste shed here that would be is ripe for the picking for one of these facilities. And once one of these gets built, wherever it gets built, and it shows proof of concept, then it's going to be a race to be second, because these facilities are going to be a major game changer.
Wow. And are there companies that are spearheading this technology?
Yeah, there are. There are actually 2 facilities that are using technology similar to what's being proposed. One of them is in Granada, Spain, and one is in Oslo, Norway, and they're achieving diversion rates that are pretty astounding. But they're using second generation stuff, whereas the stuff that we're talking about now, the configuration and the engineering and design of these would improve upon the existing facilities. And there is a company in the United States that's looking to develop these. I know that they're in advanced discussions with a number of areas that have waste sheds that would support one of these.
Okay.
But these things, these are not this is not Keene. And 20,000 tons. I mean, you're talking, you need a waste shed where it's 1,500 to 2,000 tons per day. You need 50 to 75 acres of land, preferably near transportation hubs, so that you can get access to highways and railroads. What's one of the unique factors about these AMRFs is that they co-locate on site some of the end-use processing. So you might have a mini mill right on the same campus, where if you've got, you could have a small paper mill producing tissue paper right there on the campus. So now you're not sending the stuff, to Pennsylvania to be made into tissue paper.
Sure.
You're sending it, literally across the across the block there,
right,
to get made into a new product.
That's
and so
amazing.
you got a lot of efficiencies there. And it's a job creator. I mean,
Sure.
we've got, it's estimated that if there's about 681,000 jobs that are associated with waste diversion right now in the United States, and that's at around 20 to 25%. If we go to 75%, that would add on top of that 681,000 jobs about 1.1 million jobs. So, this is a good business deal. It has great environmental benefits, and it costs less than or equal to what we're doing right now. And the reason that we don't have any of these things right now is because of the 800-pound gorillas, that it's against their interest to do this. Right now, landfilling and waste incineration, by and large, are extremely profitable enterprises, and they're not necessarily going to want to give that up without a fight.
I see. So you've talked the big behemoths of the space that shall remain nameless, but they're lobbying, I suppose, against.
Not lobbying at this point because there isn't anything to lobby against, but they're certainly
not paving the way.
They're dismissing the technology as a pipe dream.
I see. When it's in fact
very real.
Very real. And what is the name of some of the companies that are doing this technology?
Well, the one that's primary is called Upland Road.
Upland Road. Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. And so you're thinking Upland Road or a competitor within 5 years could be doing this, where we're talking 75%, and it's diversion, and it's a site, and bringing in paper products, and then they're shipping out toilet paper or printing the daily newspaper right out of that same spot.
Well, it's actually bigger than how you just framed it. So we would have one bin basically, and anything that you discarded, and right now, today you're probably going to discard between 5 and 7 pounds, the same as me.
Right.
And
from banana peels to newspapers.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And that cumulative amount adds up to about 1.6 billion pounds per day in the United States. Wow. So we are the number one generator of waste in the world.
We're number one.
We are number one. But we have 12% of the waste associated with the United States, but only 4% of the world's population. So we are by far number one in waste generation. But that said, we have the ability to do something a little different here. And this one bin system eliminates a lot of the problems because, for instance, in Keene, I have 14 permitted haulers in Keene. Now, it's in theory possible that on any given street, 14 different trucks are going down that same street to pick up their customers because their customers are different.
Yes.
So that's not necessarily the most efficient way of collecting the stuff to begin with. And that's where a lot of the cost of solid waste disposal lies, is in the collection part of it,
Right.
People having it collected at curbside. But this is a game changer. If you've got one bin, then basically the act of throwing something away, discarding something, is now an act of recycling or diversion. Yeah. And that's where I see the problem being actually solved for real.
Yeah.
Because this idea that somehow we're going to educate people to do the right thing, or that we're going to do something other than investing in infrastructure to achieve any kind of meaningful result is really a fantasy.
Yeah, I think so. And it is so difficult to get people to understand what's recyclable, what's not, and what community.
And it changes. It changes a lot, right?
Does,
I mean, sometimes, even common recyclables now, I'm seeing communities are shutting them off because the markets aren't great. And
right.
How does that impact the average person in that community? I mean, they're not paying attention to it per se. But now all of a sudden, something they used to be able to do, they can't do. What happens when they try to do it again?
Right, and then they're questioning what the use is.
Right.
If it's kind of this seesaw back and forth.
Exactly.
But, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's great. Hopefully, in 5 years, this will happen, and nobody has to do anything, and
right.
You'll save money. I mean, it's a win-win, and obviously there are big interests opposing it, but economics hopefully will win out at the end of the day.
Well, and it's also why we treat wastewater at the end of the pipe versus at the beginning of the pipe. It would be impractical to try to have wastewater systems in every single home. Right? Yeah. We have systems, we have infrastructure, but the actual processing of the waste happens at a wastewater treatment plant in order for it to be properly discharged into a waterway. It's not much different with trash.
Yeah. So maybe we could take a wild turn and talk about Charlie Brown for a minute.
Yeah, why not?
So maybe you could tell us the story of how you became the voice of Charlie Brown.
Yeah, well, okay. So, the thing that you have to remember about voice actors is that most voice actors have some kind of a talent that they inhabit a character and then they sit down in front of the microphone and then they bring that character to life. The Peanuts franchise, as it were, is all children's voices, whereas a lot of the cartoons, around, whatever cartoon we're talking about, are adult voice actors.
Simpsons, for instance, are all adult voices.
Exactly, right. Peanuts was very particular. Charles Schulz really wanted kids to be the focal point of it because it's a kid's world, and that's why you don't ever hear any adult voices in Peanuts. In fact, the adult voices that you hear is a trombone.
I never knew that until I read your book.
Yeah. So it's a trombone, and and they just wanted to create that kid's world and make that kid's world special, as it were. So I was 11 years old, and I was at recess in third grade at the Tiburon school called Reed Elementary School. And I was heading back to my classroom from recess, and I noticed that there was a line that had formed outside of a classroom that was not my own classroom. And I just stood in the line. I didn't want to go back to class because this looked way more interesting, and so I just stood in the line. I didn't know what the line was for, and I got to the front of the line, and they were like, hi, welcome. What character would you like to read for? And I had to tell them I really have no idea what you are doing here and what I'm doing here. They said, thank you, sit down and read these couple of lines. So I read a couple of lines, and I didn't think anything of it. I went back home that night and probably told my parents more about my dodgeball game than I did about anything else that happened. And about 3 weeks later, we got a call. My mother got a phone call at home from the producers of the show. That was Bill Melendez and Lee Mendelson, who were involved in the TV shows. And Charles Schulz was not involved in the day-to-day part of the TV shows at all. And they said, we really liked your son's voice test, and we want him to come into San Francisco to do another one. And my mom was like, who are you? What are you even talking about? I don't know anything about this, because I hadn't told her. But it turns out that this was a real thing, and I went into San Francisco to do several more voice tests. And I guess the process was that this was back when they had like reel-to-reel tapes,
right?
And you'd have very primitive microphones. And I just spoke into the microphone a couple of lines, and they said thank you very much, and they paid me $50 to do this when I was 11 years old in 1973. $50, pretty good money right there. So it was after the third one that they called up and offered the contract for Be My Valentine, Charlie Brown. So I was 12 years old, and I got the role of Charlie Brown in Be My Valentine, Charlie Brown. And I went on to voice two more specials after Valentine's Day. I did You're a Good Sport, Charlie Brown, and Race for Your Life, Charlie Brown. So I was 1975 and 1977. I was the fifth voice of Charlie Brown. The original voice, Peter Robbins, was the one who voiced the Christmas and the Thanksgiving specials. Okay. And sadly, he passed a few years ago. He took his life. He was depressed and had some personal issues. And he's obviously very missed by legions of fans. But I was very lucky to be in the right place at the right time, and I wish I could say that I had some talent, but I just happened to have the voice at that time that sounded like him.
Yeah.
And if people ask me all the time, can you still do the voice? And I always respond, if I could do that voice, I would absolutely do that voice. Yeah. But what happens when you turn 14 or 15 years old is you start going through the life change,
right?
And your voice starts deepening. And I was taping It's Arbor Day, Charlie Brown, and that's when my voice started cracking, and I was no longer able to voice Charlie Brown.
Wow!
And my career ended. And at the same time, around that same time, my parents decided to move from California to New Hampshire, and pretty much ended my acting career.
Wow. Okay. So did you get fired right then and there, or they're like, how does that work?
Yeah, they stopped calling, basically. Yeah. I mean, they basically stopped calling. I mean, it's understood how this works.
Yeah.
Once you voice out, you voice out.
Right. I mean, particularly for children's voice, if that's what they're looking for.
That's right.
And so, you're still going to comic conventions all over the country.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like 3 years ago, Melanie Cohn, who voiced Lucy when I was doing Charlie Brown, she was in a couple other productions as well as the same ones that I did.
Right.
She contacted me out of the blue on Facebook and said, I've been doing this Comic-Con circuit, and there seems to be a market for this. Would you be interested in joining me at my next one? And I was like, I guess. I mean, I don't know anything about it. This was a world I was not familiar with.
Sure.
And I went, and it was absolutely eye-opening and amazing and super fun. Meeting people for whom the Peanuts franchise or the Peanuts group, represented something, really important in their youth, and, a place of comfort and safety and, consistency. And it worked out really well, to go to one of these and meet all these fans of Peanuts and, be resurrecting my Charlie Brown career, as it were.
Right. And so you said you go to like a dozen a year?
Yeah, somewhere between 10 and 12. I mean,
Wow.
this is my third year of doing it, and we'll see, how long it continues. I mean, I've got gigs booked this year. But I am going to be finally hanging up my spikes at the end of this year for my professional life, and whether that includes going to Comic-Cons down the future, we'll just have to sort of see what's offered up.
All right. Well, the book is called Everyone's Trash: One Man Against 1.6 Billion Pounds. How can people find out more about you? Where can they get the book?
The book is available at any bookstore. Obviously, it can be purchased on those large sites that'll remain nameless. But I also am happy to have people contact me, and I'm happy to personalize it for them and then get it out in the mail to them. But any bookstore will have it available to them, and I think it's a pretty good read. I think that people would enjoy it. It's not smashing you over the head with a bunch of environmental stuff that's super heavy. It's more just really good stories.
All right. And your next comic convention?
Next comic convention is next week in Syracuse, New York.
All right. Excellent. Well, Duncan, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure.
All right. We did it.
Right on.